Welcome back to What Is, the channel that quenches your thirst for knowledge. Today, we're donning our armor and venturing back in time to explore a social and political system that dominated medieval Europe, feudalism. Forget about democracies and presidents for a moment. Imagine a world of kings, knights, and castles where power was tied to the land, and loyalty was everything. We'll explore the intricate web of obligations and hierarchies that defined feudal society and discover how this system shaped the course of European history. Feudalism emerged in Europe after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. In 476 AD, when barbarian invaders overthrew the last ruler of the empire, Romulus Augustulus. With no strong central government to maintain order, people turned to local lords for protection from the Vikings, Magyars, and other groups raiding their lands. This led to the development of a decentralized system of power based on land ownership and personal loyalty. Think of it as a pyramid of power, with the king at the top and the peasants at the bottom. At the very top of this pyramid sat the king, the ultimate source of authority. But even the king's power was limited. He needed the support of his powerful nobles to maintain control. To secure this support, the king granted large estates of land, called fiefs, in exchange for these nobles' loyalty and military service. These high-ranking individuals, known as lords and barons, as well as the vassals of the king, became powerful figures ruling over their lands and the people who lived on them. But managing a vast estate wasn't easy. Lords couldn't do it alone. They, in turn, granted portions of their land to lesser nobles, also called vassals of the lords, who pledged their allegiance and military support to their lord. This created a complex web of relationships, with lords and vassals bound together by oaths of fealty and mutual obligations. Imagine a chain of loyalty, extending from the king all the way down to the humblest knight. And at the bottom of this hierarchy were the peasants, or serfs, who worked the land and provided the economic foundation for the entire system. Since we're already at the very bottom of the pyramid, we might as well settle in and begin our story from the lowest layer of society. Although at first glance this hierarchy may resemble the structure of Roman society, there were no slaves in the social hierarchy of feudalism. So, despite being tied to the land and required to work for their lord, serfs were not slaves, at least not officially. They could not be bought or sold, and some even had legal rights, including the ability to seek protection from another lord if mistreated. In exchange for farming the land of their lord's vassals, they received protection and even food. Now, let's start our journey back to the top. The second to last tier were the knights, the vassals of the lords. It's quite an interesting and morally diverse group. See for yourselves. As a rule, all knights were bound by the Code of Chivalry. Its main principles included honor, bravery, loyalty, and the protection of the weak, with a strong emphasis on courtly love and justice. These ideals are most often described in a somewhat idealized manner, especially in literature, and often with a romantic twist. But how was it in reality? In practice, many knights didn't always follow these lofty standards. While some truly embraced the values of the code, there were others who, instead of acting as noble protectors, often behaved more like warriors for personal gain. They could engage in raids, feuds, or even mercenary work, prioritizing power and wealth over the noble ideals of chivalry. Much of what we know about chivalry comes from literature and epic poems, but the reality often fell short of the romanticized tales we read about. Nobles formed the upper levels of the feudal hierarchy. At the top of the nobility, lords and barons were granted large fiefs by the king or a higher noble in exchange for loyalty and military service. These nobles were often in charge of several smaller vassals, such as knights or minor lords, and they had considerable autonomy within their territories. The Catholic Church played a major role in feudal society too, often owning vast amounts of land and functioning like a feudal lord. High-ranking clergy, such as bishops and abbots, controlled fiefs and could even command knights. Religion provided a unifying force in a fragmented world, offering solace and guidance in a time of uncertainty. Monasteries served as centers of learning and preserved knowledge during so-called Dark Ages. Of course, only for chosen ones. When discussing nearly the highest tier of our pyramid, it's worth mentioning that feudal justice was local. Most regions lacked a national legal system, meaning that lords served as judges in their own courts. They were responsible for settling disputes and punishing criminals. This decentralized system often led to inconsistent and sometimes even absurd rulings. And, at times, brutal forms of justice. Although the king was theoretically the highest authority, the role of nobles in feudal society was central to the functioning of the system. In conclusion, they were military leaders, landowners, political influencers, and the social elite. However, their power and status were directly tied to their land and their relationships with other lords, which meant that the structure of feudalism was always fluid, subject to change as the balance of power between kings and nobles shifted over time. The king's role in feudalism had its unique strengths and advantages despite the challenges and limitations. The monarch still held considerable strength as central authority and symbolized the unity of the kingdom. His role was often seen as divinely ordained, and he was expected to maintain the moral and spiritual welfare of his subjects. Now close your eyes. Take a deep breath and imagine a beautiful royal castle. Colorful attire, live music, delicious meals. Ready? Well, castles in the feudal era were the complete opposite of this. In reality, feudal castles were far more functional than luxurious. These were not places of comfort, but rather fortresses designed for protection and survival. Here's what they were really like. Feudal castles were built to withstand sieges and attacks, so their design focused on defensive capabilities. Comfort was secondary to security. Castles had stone floors, little heating, and often limited lighting. The rooms were small, and furniture was basic, typically only the bare necessities for sleeping and eating. The lavish ballrooms or opulent furnishings we often see in romanticized depictions were rare. While the noble family had some privileges, the servants, soldiers, and other lower classes living in the castle faced tough conditions. They often worked long hours, performing labor-intensive tasks, and lived in overcrowded and uncomfortable quarters. Their lives were entirely centered around supporting the defense and maintenance of the castle. While modern depictions of castles might paint a picture of luxury, the reality in the feudal era was far more grim and practical. By now you can imagine that life in the Middle Ages was far from a bed of roses. The medieval period was filled with challenges, hardships, and constant struggles for survival, especially for those at the lower levels of society. Warfare was common. Famine and disease were frequent threats. Most people were born into their social class and remained there for life. Middle Ages were marked by stratification, feudal obligations, and a lack of mobility for many people. Though there were moments of prosperity, they were often fleeting, and survival required constant work and vigilance. Life was undoubtedly far more difficult and uncertain than many of us imagine when we think of knights in shining armor and grand castles. Ultimately, by the 15th century, feudalism had largely declined due to stronger centralized monarchies, growing towns, and economic changes. The bubonic plague killed a huge portion of Europe's population, leading to labor shortages. Serfs and peasants demanded better wages and freedoms, which ultimately weakened the feudal system. It's important to remember that this episode is just a general overview. Feudalism was not a single, uniform system across Europe. It varied significantly from region to region, adapting to the unique customs, cultures, and political circumstances of each area. Feudalism was shaped by local power dynamics, the church's influence, and even geographic conditions. In some places, it created a system of relative stability, while in others, it led to fragmentation, conflict, and competition. However, its influence shaped European society, laws, and land ownership for centuries. So, what is feudalism? It's a complex tapestry of land ownership, loyalty, and obligation that defined medieval Europe. It surely wasn't a perfect system by any means, and it evolved over time, but it was the framework that supported the medieval world for many centuries. Today, it's a reminder of the enduring human need for order, security, and community, even in the face of chaos and uncertainty. Thanks for joining us on this historical adventure. If you enjoyed this exploration of feudalism, give us a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe for more fascinating journeys through time. Got any burning questions about feudalism? Let us know in the comments. And as always, stay curious. We'll see you in the next episode.